Hello and welcome to the Monday Call. I'm your host, James Gregor, and this week we're joined by Professor Richard Holden, Chief Economist at Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, and one of Australasia's strongest economic voices. A University of New South Wales professor, Harvard PhD, and member of the Order of Australia, Richard is known for his bold views on how policy, geopolitics, and markets are shaping our region's future. Richard, first off, really appreciate you joining us on the Monday Call. And look, when I was prepping for this chat, there's so much to talk about. You're quite vocal in the press and have a column in the AFR. You've been writing for various US papers as well. And so where do you start and what should we discuss? Because not much is going on in the world at the moment of geopolitics and economics. So
yeah, it's a pretty quiet time, right?
Nothing yeah, really quiet.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of trying to think about where we start, but why don't we go? I think the best thing is would love to know a bit about your background. So where did you grow up? School, uni. What you like doing outside of the wide world of economics, and then we can sort of kick off from there.
Sure, sounds good. So I grew up in Sydney, Australia, and went to school here, went to the University of Sydney, did an honours degree in economics. And in the second half of second year, I took an American economic history course and loved it and decided I wanted to be an economics professor one day. Didn't even really know what that was. My parents hadn't gone to university, so it was all sort of new to me. I ended up working in the private sector for a year at Bain & Company Management Consulting, and then for Pacific Equity Partners, which had just started raising a private equity fund in Australia. And I did that for 5 years in total, and then decided if I wasn't going to do this economics PhD thing, I'd never do it. So I went to the US. I was lucky enough to get into Harvard, and I did my PhD at Harvard. Joined the faculty at MIT, then the University of Chicago, and came back to Australia about 14 years ago. So that's my potted history in 90 seconds.
So it's funny, when you talk about, my wife has similar background with economics from two parents that had no idea what even economics was. She grew up in Northern Ireland and ended up in Oxford. You sort of sound like you're from similar ilk. Why did you choose it? Was it because it was sort of at the top of the alphabet, or how did you get into it?
My father was in business, and so I guess I was kind of just interested in it from a young age. And I did a lot of debating in high school, and everyone told me, oh, you're going to be a lawyer or you're going to be a politician. And because I was just a kind of contrarian kid, I was like, well, I better not do that. So I'm going to do something else. And I was too squeamish to be a doctor. And so economics sounded about right. And I think it's worked out okay. So it turned out to be a good choice.
Yeah, well, I mean, the beauty of it, I guess it gives you sort of a view across economics, but also politics.
Yeah, exactly.
If you really want to get into it, and because healthcare is economics when it really comes down to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm super interested in politics. I've followed US politics really closely for a long time, and I lived there for a decade. So that's definitely a real passion of mine. And some of my academic research is kind of on the intersection between economics and politics as well. So yeah, no, it's a good degree. I tell young people, economics is a good thing to study. Because it gives you, a real quantitative training, but also it's about stuff in the world. So it served me well anyway.
So when I think about what's going on in the world at the moment, and some of, I guess, as an economist, I think mentorship is probably the wrong term, but people have different Northern Stars that they follow as economists around what sort of reflects their, I guess, view of the world, view of politics, how it operates. Maybe you wrote a really interesting article around post-neoliberalism and anti-neoliberalism, and that really interested me. But perhaps we could take a step back before we jump into that and talk about what is your sort of view, what type of economist are you? Do you have a sort of an identity of how you think about the world and how it should sort of, or could, not should, operate?
Yeah, I think of myself as being very centrist in the scheme of economics. I guess my sort of take on the world is that markets are an incredibly powerful and useful force for allocating resources, but markets aren't perfect, and sometimes they fail and need intervention. Um, but I start from the viewpoint of like let's think about what the market will do by itself, and then if we're not so jazzed about that either as a matter of theory or as a matter of practice, then let's think about how we can improve upon that. And often that's going to involve some kind of government regulation or intervention, or just trying to create, say, greater transparency or various other things. So I kind of, my default is markets are good, but they definitely require help, and not infrequently. So I was very influenced by, as an economist, by the sort of information economics revolution that really started with George Akerlof's famous Market for Lemons paper, pointing out that the presence of asymmetric information between buyers and sellers can lead markets to completely unravel and break down. And so I guess that influenced me a lot and my thinking, but I'm also hugely influenced by a very famous paper by Friedrich Hayek in 1945, which talks about how markets are such a powerful force in aggregating and communicating information.
And I guess that's really important now when we think about, the amount of information that's out there in technology and what's going on in the world with I guess we'll discuss this, but AI and those sorts of things. But how do you think about the world as we know it? And I guess as a commentator, you always have views on the world. But I guess the question that I'd love to ask you, and I couldn't wait to ask you, is governments, especially in developed economies, have high debt. They've got large deficits, aging populations, productivity is a bit lousy, uh, social security is increasing. Like, what do we do? How do we fix it? Like, what happens? And when you think of your centrist views around markets are good, but we need to intervene, how do you square those things?
Yeah, my view is that we need to take fiscal responsibility really seriously, and we need to try and be more sustainable and responsible than certain governments have been. I don't buy into the view that's kind of quite popular at the moment, which is that we just need to raise taxes across the board and that'll solve our fiscal problems. I think that's not the way to go, and that's kind of a cheap way out. So I think we need to think about taxing smarter, not necessarily more, but also just have some more spending restraints. I don't think there are easy solutions to any of these problems, but this sort of fiscal responsibility thing I think is really pressing, and I'm mindful of that in Australia with a last federal budget that basically announced 10 consecutive budget deficits going forward. We're going to have to grapple with these issues, even though we start in Australia from a pretty low debt to GDP level. We're not in bad shape now, but America wasn't in bad shape 20 years ago, and it's not in great shape now.
This is sort of what scares me a little bit when I think about Australia and New Zealand. I think Australia is probably, in slightly better position just because they've had, great growth around commodities in the banking sector and things. But when we think about New Zealand, Australia has low debt to GDP. Deficits are there, but they're not excruciatingly high when compared to other countries. But they still have that same dynamic of, I don't know if these stats are entirely verified, but, there used to be 20 workers for every retired person. And, we're slowly getting to 3 workers for every
Mm.
retired person. And then I've been in the UK for 2 years, and they're in real trouble. They've got this great thing called national insurance, which will fund the pension, and now it's no longer going to get anywhere near it. The US have got a huge issue around wanting to do cuts, but only can cut social security because they don't have much anywhere else other than defense to cut. What do they do? And because you're right, if they keep raising taxes, then that creates other growth issues.
Yeah, they've got huge problems around retirement savings and pensions, as you point out, and that's just a very big deal. I think one of the things that Australia has navigated incredibly well is our compulsory superannuation scheme that was introduced in the early 1990s by Paul Keating, who was Treasurer at the time and then became Prime Minister. And I look at that and it's kind of funny in a way, which is this is a centre-left Labor government, although maybe we'll come to this, who are now sometimes called by some people neoliberal, which I find I find kind of amusing in a way. But they introduced this scheme, and it ratcheted up from requiring workers to sort of compulsorily save 3% of their earnings, and in 3 weeks' time, it's going to be 12%. That has kept a lid on what Australia spends on the age pension, which is the sort of means-tested safety net. It's really kept that under control as a percentage of GDP, and looks like it will going forward. And that is a really great thing that we have that has taken pressure off the public purse, at least in one aspect of the social safety net and spending. And ironically, as I say, for a centre-left government, I mean, Australia's superannuation scheme is effectively what George W. Bush wanted to do in the US, which was it's effectively privatized Social Security, but with a safety net, which is the age pension. And so, ironically, a centre-left government in Australia put in place something that might look pretty right-wing in the global context, but it's put us in a really good position to deal with at least one aspect of the aging population problem that you mentioned, and that's really hitting a lot of other advanced economies very, very hard.
Do you think, or not do you think, I don't even know the answer to this question, is therefore Australia's state pension sort of the safety net? Is that means tested, or do everybody get it? How does that work?
And yeah, it's heavily means tested. There is one little wrinkle with that, which is they don't count the family home as part of the means test. So you got this slightly perverse situation where people might have sitting on a $4 million house, but because they have very little income, they get a pension, but it's not a lot of money. It's in the sort of $20,000 to $30,000 range a year, depending on the exact setup and the sort of tapering off of means testing and things like that. So it's really not a lot of money, but it is heavily means tested, and that's why we can keep spending on that, in the kind of 1.2 to 1.5% of GDP level, when you're looking at countries in Western Europe who are looking at, several multiples of that kind of percentage of GDP that they're spending on pensions for people.
What would, do you know off the top of your head, this is a harsh question, but do you know, say, what the UK percentage of pensions as a percentage of GDP would be?
I don't know the UK off the top of my head, but if you look at a bunch of countries in Western Europe, they're looking at, sort of 4% of GDP territory going into the sixes and maybe even sevens as you look forward, a generation or so. So it's the real consequence of what you said about an aging society. And the double whammy, of course, is that when you've got so many fewer workers, if you're pushed to want to get more revenue out of them. But of course, if you raise marginal tax rates, you may end up getting less. You may push your most talented people, out of the country. The people who are the highest income earners tend to be the most internationally, geographically mobile. And so you get yourself in a real bind when it comes to that.
Yeah, because I guess the issue, when we compare New Zealand and Australia, and we had this opportunity to do this sort of 20, 30 years ago, 30 years ago, you forget how old you are sometimes, 30, 40 years ago, and we didn't take it. And so therefore you do things like rely on migration and more workers coming in, and then that that creates, in UK, you're especially seeing that social, cohesion issues and the onset of Reform Party and all those sorts of things. But without that migration, that economy can't afford to keep sort of, I guess, paying it forward to pensioners. And I guess that's what's happening in the US, slightly different economic setup, but it's a real stress on cohesion versus pensioners versus, and I guess the only thing that can fix it really is productivity.
Yeah, that's basically right. I think on the immigration thing, there's the social cohesion stuff's very, very important, and we've seen that play out a lot, and we see that playing out in parts of Europe at the moment in pretty ugly ways, but also entirely predictable ways. I think the other thing with immigration is you've got to be careful you don't get yourself into sort of Ponzi scheme territory where you sort of say, well, we've got an aging population, so let's bring in a bunch of young people, but it's kind of like a theorem that those people become old people. And then you need to bring in more young people for the former young people you were using to pay off the old people that you started with. And so, it's like you have to start focusing on the second derivative of population growth and stuff like that. And because political processes are messy, it's kind of hard to fine tune the dial on that one, I think. And so I worry a lot about immigration as some kind of panacea to be solving this. I think you need to be dealing with the structural issues. And ultimately, you can grow your way out of most problems if you can deliver a lot of economic growth, but there haven't been too many countries, among advanced economies in the last 10 or 20 years who've done a super great job of growing their way out of trouble. So growth isn't all that easy to come by, partially because of some of these demographic issues. So it just makes everything more challenging. I don't think there are sort of any easy outs.
As a New Zealander, when we look across the ditch, we go, if only we could just be like Australia, all our problems will kind of disappear. But when you're in the country, Australia, I guess you sort of are a bit more attuned to the issues that are happening there. If the pension scheme and the compulsory 12% and this consistent 1.5% you pay on pensions is a positive, what are the issues in Australia that sort of, I guess, keep people up at night around what's going on in the economy and still this same dilemma of aging population and how to support that?
Yeah, so we've still got the aging population issue. It's not sort of hammering us on retirement savings, but it is causing issues with the tax base. We have a very, very good healthcare system that I think is a wonderful mix of a public system, Medicare, but with carrots and sticks for people to get sort of top up private health insurance. That I think is a really great mix of a universal system with healthcare as a right, where everyone, even if you're one of the higher income earners who really, to avoid tax penalties, have to buy private insurance, Medicare is still like a baseline. And so you're part of the system and you care about the system, and you and your family and your kids or whatever are exposed to the system. So you don't have this US style thing of like people in the US can opt out of an enormous amount of stuff if they're wealthy enough, not just obviously, any kind of public health care, which doesn't, there's Medicaid, right? But it's not just in the health sphere. I mean, wealthy people opt out of like trash collection and fire services, like almost every part of the administrative state is kind of potentially privatized in the US. So I like our retirement savings system in Australia. I like our healthcare system. I think we've got real problems with education and our sort of test scores in both absolute terms and relative to other other countries have been in decline for 20 years, and that's no good. And that feeds into everything from social mobility to productivity problems. I think we've got challenges there. We've got a huge housing affordability problem that's been a long run thing that governments of both stripes have totally squibbed on. They've tended to do the absolutely wrong thing and kind of put more demand side subsidies in place rather than grappling with the supply side issues. And so we've now got a situation where it's not just an economic problem now, it's really a social cohesion problem in terms of housing. And it's also a very real economic problem, which is people often can't afford to live where the right jobs are for them, or they're spending an hour each way, 2 hours a day commuting. And it's cool to listen to some podcasts and stuff, and I do that a lot as well. But when people are commuting for 2 hours each day, that takes its toll both socially and economically, and people may not live in the areas where there's the best match job for them because they can't afford to. We see it with people who are, nurses or firefighters or in the police force, having to commute incredibly long distances from where they can afford to live to where the jobs are. That's just a recipe for disaster on multiple fronts. So that's a big issue for Australia. And then we've got this productivity problem that many advanced economies have. But we have had basically no labour productivity growth since 2016. And, the current government in their last term basically threw a bunch more sand in the gears of the industrial relations system. So that's going to make productivity growth harder to get, not easier to get, whatever the potential virtues of their industrial relations changes, that they're definitely not helping productivity and growth. And so, we've got our challenges in Australia. One of the things that maybe it's always this grass is greener thing, but I think one of the things that some Australians like me kind of look across the ditch, but in the opposite direction to you guys, and kind of think about is kind of how nimble and in a sense sort of entrepreneurial as a country and as a people. I think New Zealand is. It's very hard for an Australian to say something nice about Kiwis, like we're trained to do the opposite from birth. But I think by virtue of the fact that New Zealand does have a comparatively small population, I think you guys have had to be, really entrepreneurial and nimble and can't afford to have, brutal tax rates or all the smart people will literally just leave. And so I think Australia could do with a little bit more of that kind of Kiwi spirit, actually.
It's interesting. It's not until you do travel, like I said, I was back in the UK last couple of years, and you do really appreciate how low the tax rate is in New Zealand. And I don't think there is this appreciation from New Zealanders until they travel, that, when you're paying the amount of tax, and it's not just income tax in somewhere like the UK, it's all the other associated taxes with
Right.
just existing. And yet there's, I know, no one likes paying taxes. Death and taxes is a certainty, though. But it's interesting how you can still have a country like Australia that can, have the growth that you've had, but still, high taxes are still prevalent, and perhaps there's always a balance that you can have. I guess it's a good segue into that article I read that you were talking about post neoliberalism, because it is about that inequality. So neoliberalism, and you know what, I'm not even going to try and play it back. Why don't you tell us about what post neoliberalism is? And I guess sort of from my simple brain, it's sort of talking about there are some good things about free markets, but actually, like you're saying at the start, there's some intervention needed, and it's all about really driven by inequality and disparity of wealth between people in a country.
Yeah, so I personally think of neoliberalism as being exemplified by Reagan and Thatcher, and I think of the Hawke-Keating government in Australia, or the Blair government in the UK, or the Bill Clinton administration in the US. as being, centre-left governments understanding that markets are good, but that they didn't want to do the brutal Thatcher-Reagan version of it. There's a rewriting of that where people say, no, Clinton and Blair and Hawke and Keating were all neoliberal as well. I don't think it really matters too much what we call them, although that bugs me a little bit when that moniker is given to them. But I think there were aspects of neoliberalism that still sort of seeped through. And then there's a fork in the road where you say, do we try and, sort of update the Clinton, Blair, Hawke Keating project to make it, even more fit for purpose for the 2020s. And that's what I guess I'd call sort of post-neoliberalism. And then there's sort of a reaction to what's gone before that I think I might call anti-neoliberalism. And that's the kind of, more like the Democratic Socialist AOC, Bernie Sanders. And to be honest, parts of what the Biden administration did when it came to a whole lot of things. It was like, we're not so sure how excited we are about free trade. All of a sudden, we want to have industrial policy winner picking. We're going to get unions super powered up to be able to, intervene more. And it's that aspect of stuff that I think is a kind of that I call anti-neoliberalism. What I worry about there is that that's going to kind of kill what we get out of markets, and that's going to be a huge problem. And that we're gonna end up in a really bad place rather than trying to fine tune what we had. So I wrote a book in 2022 with Rosalind Dixon called "From Free to Fair Markets: Liberalism After COVID-19," and that's it's a book for a popular audience. It's, there's no math in it, and it was. What we were trying to do there was to say, how can we kind of tackle some of the big challenges like poverty, climate change, in some instances, corporate power, but in a way that doesn't damage the power of markets to deliver good economic outcomes. So, we thought of that as a kind of, for whatever it was worth, our take on how you refresh the third way project of Clinton and Blair and Hawke and Keating, rather than throw it out the window. And what I worry about now is that even centre-left governments like the Biden administration and the Albanese government in Australia are going further than that and are kind of throwing that stuff out the window, and that worries me.
I guess it's part of, I don't know if it's populism or the most prevalent is in the US, where perhaps there's such a disparity between those anti-neoliberalists and people that have felt hard done by, and rightly so, over the last sort of 20 years, but there's sort of no middle ground, and it's very, very bipartisan, in or not bipartisan, in terms of how do you meet that center ground without going to the extremes on a left and right? And then what happens is each time a new government comes in, they sort of jolt left or jolt right, depending on who's got the most votes, and it's all always very close. And so, not the whole population wants it to go that way. Does that? I guess the point of my comments is: do you worry about that from a social cohesion point of view, even in places like Australia?
Yeah, I do. I think you characterize it really well. Part of why I worry about it, not only from sort of social cohesion, I think you're seeing that in the US, right, where the polarization is such that the people who voted for Donald Trump, not all of them, but a fair chunk of the people who voted for Donald Trump just despise the Democrats, have a visceral hatred, and plenty of people who voted for Kamala Harris just despise Donald Trump. And I think that's the sort of social cohesion concern, and January 6 is kind of what happens, right? When those things play out. I also worry very much from a policy making perspective, because there are a whole lot of policies that I think that the climate transition is a good example of it, but there are plenty of others where you know business needs to know that this isn't a policy just for the next 3 years, but this is a policy for the next 20 years. And of course, as you say, like with a closely divided electorate, one party's probably not going to be in power for the next 20 years. It's going to change back and forth. Well, if every time we change government, we say, let's shut down all the coal mines, let's reopen all the coal mines, let's roll out a lot of solar panels, let's destroy all the solar panels. You can't have investment certainty if you're chopping and changing policy like that all the time. And it's not just in climate policy, it's also in, we're going to appoint people to be central bank governors who, don't care about inflation. Oh, wait a minute, we're going to appoint people like we have been since the 1990s who have an inflation targeting regime. And you could just go through a whole range of other government policies. Our challenges, I think, have become longer and longer term and require policy certainty and stability. And in a more polarized but closely divided electorate, you kind of almost by definition can't get that, and that worries me. On top of the social cohesion issues.
Yeah, and maybe I'm looking at hindsight and it's easy to sort of surmise things, but it sort of felt like when Tony Blair or Thatcher or Reagan or Clinton, Keating, John Howard were sort of in power, that even if you didn't vote for him, there was this sort of respect about that they've got an ideology that's trying to fix or improve the country that they're leading, and now it seems it's you see it on X and the tweets and things. It's just unbelievable, and it feels like it's all happened quite fast.
Yeah, it does feel like it's happened fast, and social media may well have some responsibility there. But no, I think that's right. And I think about the Australian experience. We had Hawke and Keating for call it 13 years, and we had Howard and Costello for call it 10, 11 years. And they didn't do everything the same. They didn't agree on everything. There were real differences, and there were people in the Labor Party who tried really hard to try and dislodge John Howard from office and weren't very happy with some of the things that he did, and the same was true the other way around. But I don't think people thought the sky was falling in when the other guys got elected. I was like, that's not quite the way we would do it, but it's not a million miles apart, and maybe we tweak this or tweak that, or maybe there were sometimes some more fundamental differences, particularly on social issues. But I think we're losing that, and that's and that's true in a lot of countries. I think we see it really starkly in the US, but you see it in like Western Europe. I mean, you've got sort of centre-left parties, and then you got the Alternative for Deutschland, right? Which is like they're neo-Nazis, and Italy's got related problems. France has got related problems. Nigel Farage is not in the category of some of those people that I just spoke about, but Britain's got increasingly polarized, and so it's a global problem, I think.
So when this is perhaps a jolting segue into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, but if you're an accountant or a financial advisor or an investor, and this is we've just framed for the last half an hour how sort of the world is operating at the moment, and then you go sort of more micro, and you're the chief economist of the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand. It'll be interesting to know how you got there and why that role, because I'm sure there was lots of different things where your career could have taken you. But how do businesses think about it, and what do they need to think about? Because it can get it's all a bit too hard with some of the setup. But I guess every decade or so has sort of some difficulties involved, and you could say the same thing. But how do you think about it from a micro perspective and business, and how they should be, I, I guess, crawling, walking, running through these types of issues that are going on? And then we'll jump into to how you got there.
Yeah, I think they kind of don't have a lot of control over it, so they've got to try and do the best that they can to advocate to governments of whatever political persuasion for what the practical implications of certain kind of policies are going to be. I think that they often need to compromise. So I think one of the disappointing things, as well as challenging things, is they often need to say, well, we can't make the kind of long-term investments that we would like to make if we thought we had policy certainty. So we're going to have to do something, a bit more second best. So that's really challenging for business leaders, I think, and I think many of them are frustrated by that, and with good reason. So I think it makes it a lot harder for business in these environments. But they just need to play the hand they're dealt. They don't have a lot of control over what that is in many instances.
And Richard, how did you end up at CA ANZ? And what, I guess when you join a role like that, it's quite different from academia in some way. But did you have a sort of a northern star that you wanted to sort of be guided by? What was your sort of goals when you got there as to what you wanted to do, or are you a communication person that just wants to communicate what's going on in the world to your members? How do you think about the role, and how did you end up at CA ANZ?
Yeah, well, it's not a full-time role. I'm still an economics professor, but I'm really pleased to be able to be part of the team at CA ANZ, and I'm really just supporting the people who were there already in terms of um, communicating our message and about what's important, and that's I guess something that I have some facility with, and also in just thinking about the kind of policies that the organization advocates on behalf of our members. And so, thinking about informing some of that policy process, and policy advocacy to government. So, it's a role that I very much enjoy. I'm not the most important person in that organization by any means, but I'm very happy to be part of the team.
Do you have any specific policy advocacy you're doing at the moment that is sort of top of mind that you could openly talk about?
Uh, I'm thinking quite a bit across a range of wearing different hats about productivity stuff, and I'll have some more to say about that in coming weeks and months. But I think that Treasurer Jim Chalmers here, the day after the election, the morning after the election, said productivity is going to be our real focus for the second term, and I think providing government with a range of different options there, and things that they will sometimes hear from the Productivity Commission in Australia, which is filled with a lot of really outstanding people, several of whom I'm friends with and talk to on a regular basis. But I think it's also good to get ideas from a range of different sources. And, I certainly am going to be one of those, but I think sort of contributing to that debate is something that I think is really important at this point in time.
The best thing about doing these podcasts is I get to ask all the questions, and so so something I've been in markets a long time, but the word productivity gets bandied around a bit by people that perhaps aren't as close to it from an academic or a policy position as you are. Can we just for a couple of minutes take a step back and, like, what is productivity? What do we actually mean by, like, what's the definition of productivity? What is it?
Yeah, so it's a great point. In fact, it's the topic of next week's financial review column that I'm writing. So I'll be
Oh, brilliant.
be writing it this weekend. So it's on my mind. Um, So productivity, the easiest one to think about is labor productivity. It's just how much you get out, how much you produce for a given unit of labor. So you could think about it as an hour of somebody's time. And it's just how much we get out. And then we typically think about what the growth in that is over time. So, how much more do we get out of that unit of labor this year compared to last year or 5 years ago? And the reason it's really important, there's this it's become an aphorism, this quote from Paul Krugman, quarter century or so ago, where he said, um, you know, productivity. He said something along the lines of productivity isn't the only thing, but in the long run, it's almost the only thing. Our ability to raise living standards is almost entirely dependent on our ability to raise output per worker, and that's why we care about it. Now, there's a couple of things to unpack here, I think. So, one level, that's a very, very simple definition. On the other hand, productivity is kind of like it's not a very descriptive word. It's also a word sometimes people think of as like, well, that just means making me work harder. You want to increase productivity. It means like, you're just going to make me work harder. And it doesn't mean that at all, but it's easy to understand why people might think that. It's actually more about working smarter. And the thing that I'm trying to get people to focus on more and unpack is if, you sort of talk about, well, I just said, how much do you get out for a given unit of labor? Well, let's think about what we get out. Well, whether it's, physical goods like a phone, or whether it's services, which are a really big chunk of like Australia and New Zealand's economic output, stuff has sort of two dimensions, quantity and quality. And I think what's not focused on enough when it comes to productivity is the quality dimension of things, and that actually producing higher quality versions of the same amount of stuff is an increase in productivity. And so, we can increase the productivity of government services in a whole range of ways. It may not be hard to get people who are, doing customer service at here we call it Service New South Wales or something, or you might call it the DMV in the US, the people who are there helping you get driver's licenses and register your car and stuff like that. It's probably going to be pretty hard to get them to do more quantity, but it may be possible to get them to do more quality by making their job easier, by augmenting it with all kinds of technological stuff, by giving them better data, giving them better equipment that allows them to service customers probably faster, but also probably better. And so I want to get us to focus more on the quality of stuff. And part of the reason why I think that's important is because when you think about things like artificial intelligence, one reaction is, oh my God, that's going to put people out of work. It's a terrible thing. We've got to resist that. I think the right way to think about it is AI is generally going to help a lot of people do their jobs better. And better, yeah, it might mean more widgets come out of the end of the production line, but it probably means higher quality widgets. And when you think about services, it's maybe easier to see that quality dimension, coming through. And so if it allows our aged care workers to provide better quality of service to the people who they serve, that would be a great increase in productivity. And I think that's very possible when it comes to thinking about some of these new technologies that are arising.
That's fascinating when you think about it from a services point of view. And what I don't understand then is, why is the US such a highly productive economy? Or is it, maybe that's a better question, is it so much higher in productivity than, say, Australia and New Zealand? And is that just because their ability, these again are sort of sweeping generalizations that get waved around, but is it because it's easier to hire and fire staff so you can be more productive?
Yeah, so they're the only country among, say, OECD countries or most advanced economies that have had pretty solid productivity growth in the last, call it, decade or so. So they are more productive. I think you're right. Part of that comes from they just have a they have just a tougher, more brutal labor market. So, most employees in the US are so-called at-will employees. You can just fire people because you just don't like them, and they have relatively few protections. Now, a lot of Australians and Kiwis probably don't want us to have an industrial relations system that looks like the US industrial relations system. We probably don't want to have a whole lot of undocumented workers who get paid very low wages and forced to work very hard because they don't have a lot of legal protections, but they also, don't have a lot of other choices if they're coming from, war-torn parts of South or Central America or very poor parts of South and Central America. So we probably don't want to replicate that. I think there is a kind of dynamism in the US economy that sort of permeates it, that does help drive productivity growth. And those are aspects that we probably do want to figure out how to emulate, at least in some way. And that's where I think technologies like artificial intelligence could really help other economies, sort of boost productivity by having these technologies complement the skills that workers have more than substitute for them.
Yeah, so it's instead of sort of slashing and burning labor when you want to, it's actually helping that labor be more productive in role.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what we need to be looking for, and that really informs a lot of things. It also informs how we want to educate people. What I do at university or what people do in high school or primary school. We want to be trying to focus on, how can we teach people to use these technologies early on so that they can use them as a tool and it can complement their other skills rather than being a substitute for them.
And then productivity and capital versus labor, and there's talks and budgets that we need to spend more on capital and not just rely on more labor. Is that part of that equation?
Yeah, it's totally part of the equation. I mean, speaking of complements and substitutes, capital and labor go well together. They're generally complementary in the long run. And one of the things in Australia, for sure, has been that we've had very weak business investment for a long period of time now. And that's not a criticism of business. Apropos of our earlier discussion about the political environment in which they operate, I totally understand why they are reticent to invest at sort of bullish levels. But a consequence of that is that we do have a reduction in productivity, and so we need to get the settings right. Part of that's to do with how we tax companies, but part of that is also providing them with a more certain policy environment so that they want to invest.
Yeah, it's perhaps in New Zealand, and I don't know if you've caught up with this policy announcement in the budget here, but around the instant sort of 20% depreciation you can do on any capital investment for a New Zealand business. And I guess that's part of what you're saying is if you can, encourage business to spend money on capital, that one boosts the economy, but also, helps with those sorts of issues.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I did see that that announcement in the New Zealand budget. I think that's a good move, and I'm in the process of advocating for a related kind of policy here, where we have kind of accelerated depreciation over a period of time. And it could be this kind of instant asset write-off type thing, or it could just be bonus depreciation for a period of time while we transition to a lower company tax rate, which in Australia is 30%. It's pretty high by OECD standards, and so I think we can finesse a transition there and create an environment where it's more attractive for businesses to invest.
Richard, in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you, perhaps it's something that you're passionate about because you kind of mentioned it, and it's US politics. As we speak, there's been tweets from Trump and Elon Musk having a nice little shindig in the social media ecosystem. But also when we think about in the US, things like, you're an alumni of Harvard, what's going on there, and perhaps US relinquishing some of its soft power around university and people going to Harvard that are from outside the US. Do you have any, how are you thinking about the situation there, and do you have any views of how you think will play out, and any sort of things that you're looking at that you think are scary, interesting, what to watch for?
Yeah, look, I'm very worried about what's going on in the US, what's happening to the university sector, and my alma mater is getting the most attention, and rightly so, because they're getting the harshest treatment, and they're also, the most important university in the United States, although there are many wonderful and hugely important institutions. Um, I think the kind of vindictiveness from the Trump administration is incredibly counterproductive and very sad to watch. It's really going to affect all the major universities, uh, in terms of taxing their endowment more, making it potentially taking away their tax exempt status, potentially restricting their ability to enroll foreign students. There's, as you pointed to, there's a soft power aspect to that, which is hugely valuable for the United States. They've blown up another soft power aspect, which was USAID, which was just an incredibly valuable thing for doing good in the world, but also for America rightly being seen to do good in the world. And I think Bill Gates said recently that the image of the world's richest man taking decisions which are killing some of the world's poorest people is not a good one. It's a bad look. So I'm very worried about what's going on. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the midterm elections in 2026, in sort of 18 months from now. I hope that those are fair and free elections. You know, it would have sounded apoplectic to even raise that as a question a few years ago. I think now can't take anything for granted. But I think those are going to be a potentially important circuit breaker if there's a repudiation from the public of everything from the tariffs to some of the other policies. So we'll have to see. But I think the damage that's being done will be reversible if it'll take time to catch up, and we may never get back to where we would have been. If it's economic damage, it's reversible. If it's damage to institutions in a serious way, that may not be reversible. And I think that's the thing that really scares a lot of people, myself included.
Do you think that markets have done a good job? And we talked about markets, I guess, needing some intervention, but actually are a pretty good proxy of reflecting what's going on, and actually have been quite good at dictating and I guess bringing back to maybe reality some of the things that have been happening? Or do you think they're not powerful enough, and actually it's going to take people and willpower and voices to really see, I guess, cooler heads to prevail?
I think markets are a very helpful force in this. In this instance, it's, capital markets and the bond market in particular that's sort of playing a real role. There's reason to believe that some of the back down on the most extreme stuff on tariffs by the president came as a consequence of the very sharp spike in long-term US government bond yields. But my understanding of that is that it really took Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to explain that to the president. I don't mean to say President Trump doesn't know what the yield on a bond is. Of course he does. But that it took the Treasury Secretary to kind of really make the case that this was a big problem and couldn't be ignored, as I understand it. So I think the people around the president matter a great deal as well. And as has been widely commented on in the first, Trump 45, he was surrounded by a lot of pretty highly qualified, pretty sensible people. Yep. And there aren't too many of them there now. I think Bessent is, I'd prefer if Janet Yellen was still Treasury Secretary, but Scott Bessent's a very well qualified and credentialed person, and by all accounts, a very intelligent person. But, the trade czar, Peter Navarro, is no one would describe him in those positive terms. Let's put it that way. And then you think about Stephen Miller, basically being in charge of immigration. You think about some of the people who've got carriage of other important agencies. I mean, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Authority, FEMA, in the last 48 hours, it's been reported that he said, "Oh, I didn't know that there was a thing called hurricane season in the United States." Well, he's in charge of kind of dealing with hurricanes. He doesn't even know that there's a hurricane season. So the level of competence in the administration, I think, is rightly being questioned, and that's pretty worrying. And there's nothing bond markets can do to help deal with the fact that you've got a guy running FEMA who doesn't know what his job is.
I mean, I laugh then, but it's just there's not much you can do but just be in disbelief at some of the stuff. And yeah, it takes strong leadership, and I guess that's what's missing from the other side is strong leadership to stand up and go, what's going on here, and we need to do better.
Yeah, I think and maybe this is the sort of note to end on or something, but the the shakeout of the whole fact that Biden should never have run for re-election, and that was apparent to a whole lot of people. But he effectively did. Of course, he handed over to Kamala Harris 107 days before the election, but he was not an effective advocate for that side of politics. On one hand, Kamala Harris got dealt a really difficult hand. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that she's a defective candidate, and many of us knew that. And right now, there doesn't seem to be a real alternative on the Democratic side, and so they're going to have to figure that out sooner rather than later, and how they're going to prosecute the cases and an effective and active opposition to an administration that's doing enormous damage.
Richard, I've got one last question. We will have a lot of accountants listening into this. If you had one message, I've written here young accountants, but I don't think it's just young accountants. If you had one message to accountants or economics, I guess professionals, students, people thinking about it, what would you say to them? What's when you were a student of economics and now you are where you are now, and obviously you can feel and hear the passion in your voice. Do you have any sort of sage advice you give your students or colleagues around sort of the world at large and your career in this sort of in this part of the economy?
Yeah, I think sort of you got to learn your craft. And I was lucky early in my career that I got some fantastic opportunities to learn a lot, and I think make the most of those learning opportunities. One of the upsides of the fact that I worked very, very long hours, what now would be deemed socially unacceptable hours, I suspect, was that I got a lot of experience in a relatively short period of time. But take those learning opportunities. If you've got slightly better work-life balance, good for you. But take the opportunities while you can. I think the other thing I try to tell people is, if you are interested in the world, read widely. Listen to great podcasts like this one. Read the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and read the newspapers and soak it all up. There's so much easier to do than it used to be. And I'm going to date myself here, I guess, but I remember when I had to get a New Yorker subscription. It was mailed from the US. You couldn't even, it came 6 weeks late. It cost a fortune. It cost hundreds of dollars a year. Maybe probably cost me, like in today's dollars, like $1,000 a year for that subscription or something. And now, of course, you can just get it on your phone. You can listen to it. You can read it. So if you're interested in the world, there's great opportunity to soak up a lot of stuff and be really well informed. And I think people will find that good for their career, but also I think good for them as people, and often really quite a lot of fun.
Well, Professor Richard Holden, that's a great place to end it. Thank you very much for your time, and a really interesting discussion, and appreciate all your views, inputs, and advice. So thanks for coming on the Monday Call.
My pleasure. Thanks for a great discussion.
New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds Active Income Series, NZ Funds Active Inflation Series and NZ Funds Active Growth Series, together the NZ Funds Active Series, as well as the NZ Funds KiwiSaver Scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, NZ Funds Wealth Builder and NZ Funds Income Generator. For further information or to request a copy of the product disclosure statement for each of these, please contact NZ Funds or visit nzfunds.co.nz. This recording is provided for information purposes only. The information provided is not intended as a substitute for specific professional advice on investments, financial planning or any other matter. Past performance is not an indication of future returns.